Hi, my name is Pascal Bickmans and I'm CG generalist at Gameloft. My work on MCVersus was to create a different spherical environment map. I'm using mainly three software, Terragen for creating the cloud and the sky, Houdini to process all the geometry data, and Clarisse for scene layout, shading, and final rendering. As we are working on mobile, the final image is encoded as 8-bit RGBM. The alpha channel stores the luminance of the image, and we use it as a multiplier for faking HDR exposure effects. Houdini was a huge help for creating the mega city structure. It was very easy to add details on existing models, creating parametric version of them, bridges, pipe system, greebling. Eventually, Houdini was also used to create mountains, terrain, and a piece of canyon. I'm using Houdini for a little bit more than 1 year now, and I was very lucky that Gameloft gave me a little bit of time to learn the basics. So the first few months I've created a lot of small prototypes, parametric bridges, lazy selection system, a snow generator, rocks of course, Windows generator. I also created my first favela prototype. I tried to recreate the path generator from Ghost Recon, stylized rock system, my first stadium, greebers and greebers and greebers, and finally a little bit of Vex, which helps me to create this Minesweeper grid, for example. I'm really not a technical artist, and all I'm using here is the variable operators and a little bit of expressions, and that's it. So I've prepared breakdowns of two different elements of the vistas. The first one is this mountain favela scene. Since version 16, Houdini has a complete set of tools to manipulate and generate height fields. All the basics are covered. You have different noise that you can mix. You can create mask, you can add distortion, remapping the elevation, and there is also an erosion operator. The fun comes when you start to mix height field with existing polymodeling tools. For instance, I want to try to find a way to flat the terrain on a small basement like here. And there are actually two nodes for that. There is an height field project that lets you project height field on any arbitrary geometry. And the height field masks by object that let you create masks based on arbitrary geometry. Here it's very useful, for example, to blur the transition and add a little bit of distortion only on the projected area. It's also a nice way to create mask for controlling, for example, a tree ecosystem, so you don't have trees inside houses. And here is the final results of the transition. So when it works for one basement, you can then deploy it on the whole terrain. So here I have dozens of small basements, and here is the result of the projection. Later, I will create a point cloud on this basement that will be used for scattering different models of favelas. One feature I want to add on the terrain is an electric pole network system. So I start with a very simple prototype, just creating two tubes, a few boxes, and I linked the two elements with a few polylines. Then I cycle between all the polylines, resample the lines, so adding more points, and I modulate the Y position with a parabola formula. I can then mesh the lines with a polywire operator, and actually every line has a small multiplier of the parabola equation, so there is a slight different tension between all the curves. Well, because I can do it. Once the prototype is working, I can deploy it on a random terrain, and with few adjustments, it works pretty well. I can adjust the density of the pores or the density of the curves. So here is the results of the mountain so far. I can still change the shape of the mountains and all the features will be updated accordingly. The little favela model was created procedurally using basic modeling tools like bevel, extrusion, booleans, everything driven by expression and channel referencing. And at the end, I'm not just building one model, but 100 of them. Here is a little recipe I've used to break the corner of the walls. There are many ways to create that kind of effect, of course, and I was looking for something that didn't create too much polygons. So first I remeshed the wall with a very low density quality. Then I smooth the point position and I'm adding a very small displacement to push the point outside. Finally, I'm doing a Boolean intersection between the remesh and the original wall. I can then apply the same process on every element of the favela. As I didn't have the time to create my own tree system in Houdini, I'm using a plugin for Blender called the Grove. It's more like a life simulator using self-organization growing system. Very handy to create dense foliage. And the data structure look like this. The plugin create branches and trunk, of course. Then there is a point cloud at the end of the branch on which twigs are scattered. The instances twigs have a very specific orientation to create a realistic foliage. And until recently, when using a polygonal format like OBJ, Blender create a triangle cloud instead of a point cloud. It's up to the user to recreate the point cloud and the instancing system. And it was, of course, easy to recreate the data inside Houdini, cycling through every triangles, creating a point in the centroid, copy the normal from the triangle to the centroid points, and recreating the up vector between the centroid and the third point of the triangle. And while the normal and up vector is enough to get a proper orientation in Houdini, I had to create an orient quaternion attribute to make the system working inside Clarisse. And I want to thank Germano Banano, a Clarisse user that gives me the 2 lines of X code that I have to add to create the right data. So this is the instancing recreate in Houdini just with the orient attribute. So here I'm tweaking the twigs density inside Houdini, and I can have the exact same kind of control in Clarisse, replacing the twigs on the fly, so I can control the leaf size or modulate the density with a fractal noise. Here is the complete asset inside Clarisse, so the mountain, the favelas, the poles, the tree system. There are a lot of instances, of course, but the poly count is about 75 billions of polygons. And I can just copy paste the piece of mountain like it's a box. Clarisse has an insane CPU viewport, and all I have to do now is to generate 2-3 variations of the mountain and do my layout. The shading is done with different procedural texture, triplanar projection, ray trace occlusion, color variation based on instance ID. And by using ABC format, I can also extract additional attribute created inside Houdini. So I have a second little breakdown. It's this piece of canyon where I use different technique, displacement, height field, and also VDB. So displacement along normal is something you can do in any software, of course. Houdini has a lot of different noise flavor, and you can create very easily nice rocky shapes. And while this displacement works very well on a sphere, when you try to apply that on a more complex shape, you create quickly a lot of artifacts and overlapping, meaning you have to limit the strength of the displacement a lot. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. If you sample the normals of the peak model, you can see that around here, for example, the deviation is very quick in a very short area. And that's where problems happen. So my trick here is to create an over smooth version of the model. For that, I'm convert the polygonal model into a VDB. I smooth the VDB and I convert it back to polygons. And I create points normals on that model. I can then use an attribute transfer operator that let me transfer normals from the smooth model on the high-res model. So blue are the old normals and green are the new ones. So now I can apply very extreme displacement while keeping the result under control. I'm not saying that it looks better, but at least there are no more artifacts and overlapping. Same technique, different noise. Here I'm using one of the new Manhattan noise. The only difference here is that I will store the new smooth normal into a custom point attribute. And I will recall this attribute every time I want to stack a new displacement layer. So back to the canyon, the first part was to create this collection of columns. I start with a disk on which I apply a displacement so I can have lots of different shapes. I can then extrude the shape and also tapering the bottom part with a Boolean operator. I can then copy stamp the columns on a point cloud and randomize different parameters like the shapes, the size, the altitude. The next step is to convert the model into VDB. So now I'm using voxels and I can modulate, for example, the density of the voxels with a fractal noise and creating very interesting shapes. The noise amplitude is controlled by a relative bounding box Y position, so I have much more noise variation on the lower part of the model. When dealing with VDB and noise, you can often creating a flying piece. There is a nice operator for dealing with that. It's called VDB connectivity, and it lets you delete all the small flying part and just keeping the biggest chunk. At this time, I create a mirror version of the canyon, and I project the lower part on a 8 field. It doesn't look like much for the moment, but with a little bit of tweaking of the 8 field, adding distortion, remapping elevation, using a bit of blur, I get the result I was looking for. And adding a little bit of erosion always helps to have a nice looking terrain. I can now convert the 8 field as a VDB and combine it with the upper part of the canyon. Once converted into polygon, I can transfer different attributes from the erode 8 field, like the flow map, for example. It can be very useful for shading or to, for example, control density of a point cloud that will be used to scatter additional rocks. So the last step now is to create an over smooth version of the model to compute normals. I can then stack multiple displacement to create small strata and additional fine details. And again, the model is completely procedural. The final resolution takes something like 10 or 15 minutes to build. So I can create multiple variations during the night, and the next morning I can check them in Clarisse, do a selection and lay out my scene. So this is a preview in-game. The transition between the actual game level and the Vista is at some point nearly invisible. I also did some very simple smoke simulation in Houdini, and I'm using a few frames of the simulation here and there just to hide some area that wasn't looking that great. I'm very happy that I was able to create so much content and keeping everything under control. Let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.